I want to introduce my colleague, Tony Flach, to you today. And before Tony begins, just tell him that he is one of those unusual people who can say that he has really walked in your shoes. I met him literally when he was helping third-grade educators in a school system grapple with data in the 1990s. And by the time Tony was done, he had a system-level impact on a system that wound up winning the Broad Award for the best urban system in the United States. From schools that were high poverty and high minority and only a few students who were proficient, to high poverty, high minority, and all of them proficient. So Tony has really walked the talk in systems not just where he started, but now all throughout the United States. Tony, welcome to today's webinar.
Doug, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Quick overview of our time together today. The first thing we're going to talk about is putting data in its proper context, and to do that we have a device that Doug Reeves created called the Leadership and Learning Matrix. From there we're going to talk about a very simple process for making meaningful use of data and give you some examples of that process applied at 3 different levels: at an instructional level, in the classroom, at a building level, and at the district. As we get started here, first thing we'd like to do is take a quick poll. So if you'll take a look at the upcoming slide here, there's a poll question that's going to ask you what kinds of data that you currently collect and analyze. So if you would please just respond. You may respond to more than one there. We'll give you about 30 to 45 seconds in which to choose what kind of data do you currently analyze. Please select all that apply.
And please take about 10 more seconds. And let's see what we have.
So you see the level of responses there, folks, and fairly typical. I would say what you see on the screen there represents where we were in my school district when Doug Reeves and the Leadership and Learning Center first started to work with us there. We spent a lot of our time taking a look at state assessment results. We were getting better at looking at district benchmark results, and we're really beginning the work of using formative assessments, but weren't really sure how to make those connect with what we were getting from district quarterly exams as well as our state assessment. And I would say this is very typical. Some of our better schools and school leadership teams were actually taking a look at specific instructional practices within their building and how that pertained or how that related to what they saw in the form of student work samples. In order to make...
Doug, I would just want to add that throughout the day you'll hear Tony talk about cause variables and effect variables. The first 4 of these are effect variables. That last one, instructional practice, is cause variables. So I want us to really note how much more likely we are to pay attention to effects than causes. And if we don't get a better balance there, we're not going to be able to analyze causes in a way that helps us improve the results.
Absolutely right. In fact, we could add to this poll here, if there were space, to put leadership practices on there as well. That would be another example of specific cause variables that we could monitor. So to make meaningful use of all of this data, it's helpful to place that in a context. And so what you see before you on the screen here is what we call the Leadership and Learning Matrix. The intent of the matrix is to provide a sense of relationship, or to help us establish a relationship between what we do and what we get. So along the horizontal axis there, you'll see the label cause data, or application of antecedents of excellence. Vertical axis are the effect data points, or percent of students proficient, say, on our state end of course exam or on our district benchmark results. And what we find, folks, is that schools or school systems fall into one of 4 quadrants, depending on how well they can relate what they do with what we get. If you see the leading quadrant here has just been circled, schools and school systems that are in this quadrant have been paying attention to a very few things. They've been measuring and monitoring the actions of the adults in the system, and only a couple of things. They might be taking a look at the percentage of students or excuse me, percentage of teachers that collaborate around formative assessment results, how well they do in that collaboration. And because they're measuring and monitoring few things, they're able to lay the results of the adult practice against student outcomes and establish a relationship. When we do more of this, we get better student achievement results. I remember a time in my own district where it was like the curtain had been drawn aside and I could see the man behind the throne in the Wizard of Oz. We were taking a look at 6 of our schools that had had some very significant gains in state social studies assessment scores, and we were really puzzled by that. Well, in all 6 of those schools, as we dug further into their data, we realized that they had independently determined that their problem wasn't so much social studies content as content area vocabulary. And so they all determined to do something about it, and they put content area word walls in place. They measured and monitored the use of those word walls on a monthly basis throughout their schools. And at the end of the year, had seen gains both on regular vocabulary quizzes during the year and some really significant gains on the state assessment results. Now, that made those schools leading, and if you see replication of success likely, not only could those 6 schools repeat those successes the following year, but they were able to share those practices with the other buildings in the district, and the following year, upwards of 30 schools did the same things in the same way and got similar results. But in order to do that, we have to measure both the cause data, or pay attention to the actions of the adults in the system, and monitor that as closely as we do the effect or the outcome data in order to get to that leading quadrant. So in the next slide here, I want to define for you the 2 types of data, and Doug's already given you a quick definition of that. Effect data, as he described, are results or outcome data, and what we find is this is what we usually take a look at. But if you'll think back to the results of the poll, the typical data that we review are state assessments, benchmarks, DRAs, maybe end of course or end of semester finals. But not as many of us responded that we're paying attention to those formative assessment results or to student work samples throughout the year. So while we're used to taking a look at effect data, the most effective schools and school systems out there are actually investing the majority of their time and their teachers' time, their leaders' time, looking at the results of formative assessments, short cycle, very focused assessments that measure the impact of teaching and leadership practices and looking at the subsequent student work samples. So I'd ask you folks to consider where do you have more of the needed data that we're describing here? Where do you have access to that? Do you have those formative assessments already in place? Are you taking a look at student work samples? If not, where are there opportunities to do so? The second data source here is, as Doug described, the cause data. And again, this is specific action about, or excuse me, specific data about the actions of the adults in the system. Now, this is all adults in the system. This is not just typically what the classroom teachers are doing, but it's also information about specific building administrator practices, about central office practices. Typically, when we describe cause data with our clients in our schools, the usual data sources that they'll reference are demographic information. They'll describe for us a percent of students low socioeconomic status, attendance, and discipline, and certainly those are antecedents. But what's needed here is information regarding specific instructional practices, like the frequency of feedback. Folks, hopefully you're becoming familiar with a gentleman by the name of John Hattie, a researcher out of New Zealand, and some of his groundbreaking research in visible learning for teachers. One of the highest impact professional practices that Hattie's been able to find is the use of feedback, and so that might be something that a leadership team in a building or a district would want to pay attention to.
Tony, we've had several people ask some questions about both how we're going to measure cause data as well as about how we define formative assessment. And feedback is probably the best single illustration of that, because when you go into a classroom, even for 10 minutes, you can literally count percentage of students who received feedback, You can observe if there's 30 kids in the class and 20 of them got feedback, that's 66%. It's that straightforward. You can observe the nature of the feedback. Was it just binary, wrong note, or right answer, oh, great job, or was it constructive so that the feedback could actually be associated with an improvement in performance? And then thirdly, you can observe the result of the feedback. Did it have an impact on what the students were doing? So we need to demystify teaching. When we say we observe instructional strategies, we're not just saying did they do something, but to what degree did they do it? So you can see progress over the course of time, progress in collaboration, progress in the quality of feedback, progress in student individualized goal setting, and so on. Tony, why don't you take a crack at the question on performance assessment, because that word has been used sometimes in a pretty troublingly ambiguous way.
Doug, could you relay that question to me? I do not see that on my screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the we're just asking what definition are we using of formative assessment, and the only time assessment is formative is when it informs teaching and learning. You can have the identical assessment, one of which, and they both have the label formative assessment, and one is rightly labeled a waste of time. If you simply administer it, you don't get the results in time, nor are teachers given the time to collaboratively review the results and say, what does this mean for students and my teaching strategies? Somebody else with the same assessment can use it formatively, provided that they have the time and the analytical ability to use that data to actually make better decisions.
Absolutely. And what's interesting in the research of John Hattie as he's talking about feedback, one of the reasons that that practice is so powerful is not only do formative assessments provide an opportunity for feedback to students, but they're feedback to the teacher about the quality of the instructional practices, about the success of the instructional practices. And so those most effective schools and systems that we see are those that take the time, as Doug has said, to analyze the results and reflect on what they mean for their current practices. It's a checkup rather than an autopsy. So two essential questions that face us as we're attempting to make sense of this are noted for you on the screen here. We've been describing some specific examples of teaching practices, but which of those practices are associated with improvements in student learning? So where can we concretely say when we provide more of the kind of feedback that Doug Reeves described, do we see gains in student achievement? By the same note, folks, we want to pay attention to specific leadership practices. Is the leader doing classroom observations? Are those classroom observations focused on 45 or 50 variables, or are they very specific to the quality of feedback that's being provided, or the level of student engagement in the room, or the rigor of questions that are being asked of students? So the leader observing that and providing his or her teachers with feedback on that practice. Another specific leadership practice, how often does a building principal, assistant principal work with teachers in reviewing data? And so, folks, we need to pay just as much attention to the things that we do as we are currently paying attention to the results that we get. And that leads us to our next poll here, folks. If you'll take a look at the question coming up on the poll, how often do you currently take a look at data in your systems? And we'll give you about 45 seconds in which to respond to that.
About 10 more seconds, please.
So the results that you see here, folks, are excellent. Many of you are looking at data at 9 or more times a year. Very few folks are only looking at that data once a year. Again, that's the autopsy. So when you combine that with looking at the right kinds of data, you'll begin to do the things that we're seeing in the most effective schools. What's interesting here is the poll is a little bit misleading. It says 9 or more times a year. Our research and experience in the field has found that those schools that have teacher teams who collaborate at least 2 times a month around formative assessment results have significantly greater gains than those schools who meet less frequently. So even if you're in that 9 times a year category right now, folks, we need to meet really at a minimum of 2 times a month, again around these formative assessments, and as Doug described them, that's as much the use as it is the type of assessment. But what we're seeing is that those schools that do that 2 times a month, review those formative assessment results and use those results to adjust or inform their instruction, have significantly greater gains.
This is Doug. I might just add that we're not just talking about test score data here. That's the drowning in data piece. I'm talking about things like teacher observational rubrics. It can also include things like discipline, attendance, or the way that or different homework strategies. Every time, as Tony explains a cycle to you, we're not just looking at scores of kids. We're looking at what did we do that influenced the scores of kids. So take us through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. This process that you see described on the screen can be applied to any data set, and ideally, as Doug has described, we'll be using that for far more than test results. We really do have to define what we mean by data. And so the first step in the process at the top of the screen there, we have to identify the data that we are going to monitor and collect it in a simple and easy to interpret format. If we're looking at formative assessment results, this might be percent of students proficient or higher, percent of students close to proficient, percent of students further away, and what percent of students are in need of intervention. If this is adult practice, we might chart this into 3 or 4 categories. Teachers who are good at providing immediate and relevant feedback, teachers who are good at high levels of questions. So again, defining the data that we're going to collect and monitor. Once we get that, though, we have to analyze that information and prioritize our needs. Now, what's absolutely critical in this second step here, folks, is that the successful schools and teams aren't just looking at numbers. There's so often this perception that data is just numbers. It's the percentage of classrooms that had high levels of engagement. It's the percentage of students who were proficient. We absolutely have to have the work samples that go along with that. And so when we're talking about student achievement, we're taking a look at the actual written responses to the assessment so that we can analyze that work for specific strengths and needs. When we're talking about classroom practice or leadership practice, we need anecdotal information to go along with that. So Teacher Jones, when I went to her classroom, asked 37 questions. All of them were at high levels of rigor, and used a random process for selecting students to respond to those questions. So it's not just the numbers, because if we mix Teacher Jones in with Teacher Flach, who is just asking what questions and rather than how, why, or analysis level questions, we can't determine any strengths. So the data that we collect and we attempt to analyze has to be specifically disaggregated into those performance categories. We have to have evidence of the work to go along with it so that we can identify those strengths. Once we go ahead, Doug, sorry.
One of our colleagues has raised a very thoughtful question that I want to share with everybody, and that is, can you find the specific practices that are most effective in Hattie's work? And of course the answer is yes, just like you've mentioned. There's a lot of evidence that collaborative review of data leads to not only better scores by students, but also to better levels of agreement by teachers, faster scoring, so it saves teachers time, and so on. But one really important point that we want to make about visible learning is that it's not just about applying outside research to you. It's about developing a method for applying your own real-time research to you. That ultimately is what has the greatest credibility with teachers. Whenever you look at outside research, they'll always say, oh, that applies to somebody else, or those kids aren't like my kids. When you follow this process and you are collecting and charting the specific impact that you had on your students, that's what Hattie calls know thy impact. That's what I call going from the rear view mirror, what works somewhere else, to the windshield, what's happening right now with my students in my school. Much more persuasive way. So I certainly endorse what Hattie has to offer, But what's really going to kickstart your system will be when you can say, it was interesting to see what happened elsewhere, but we have evidence of what's working in our schools with our students and our teachers.
And so we would take that information, select an appropriate strategy that we're going to put in place, and then measure and monitor the impact of that strategy. So once we've analyzed our specific needs, we set a SMART goal, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. Typically, these are short-term goals, so not the end of the year gains on state assessments, but by the end of this unit, end of this week, where is it we want our students to be or our adults to be in terms of the area that we're measuring. Fourth step in the process, then, are the selection of specific strategies to accomplish those goals. Folks, I want you to think about a one-to-one correspondence between our analysis and our strategies. Step 2 of the process is the diagnosis. You know, we've gone to the doctor, we've had our vital signs checked, we've had a full physical, and here are our needs. Ideally, the doctor will prescribe a treatment based on the results of that analysis, on the results of that physical. So the most effective schools and teams select specific strategies to address the prioritized need that they've identified, a one-to-one fit. Sources of these strategies could certainly be phenomenal research like John Hattie's or those of Robert Marzano, or practices that you found to be successful in your building, in your district. But as Doug has described, the key is that these become things that we're going to do today, tomorrow, during this unit. Once we've got those strategies in place, the fifth step of the process is to determine what we call results indicators. And now, folks, I have to tell you, this is both the most challenging and, in my opinion, the most important step of the process. It's a piece that we were missing in our district as we began this work, because we would select our strategies and then wait till the next administration of whatever assessment or next observation to see if those strategies were successful. Results indicators are descriptions of immediate success. So what would it look like if we put this strategy in place? What would it look like if the students are engaged in this strategy? And what would we be seeing in daily work that would tell us that the strategy is doing what it's supposed to do? So in the work of our students, in the work of our teachers, in the work of our building principals. This allows for real-time course corrections, and that's what makes the difference between schools that increase student achievement and schools that see dramatic gains in students' achievement in professional practice. That results indicator.
Let me jump in with a couple of questions that our colleagues have raised. Would you, Tony, first of all, just go over, because a lot of people use the word SMART goals, but they're not sometimes used the same way. Will you do your definition again?
So yes, again, by SMART goal, we're talking about goals that are specific either to student population or to an adult group. So we could write a SMART goal for ESL 5th graders, or we could write a SMART goal for 8th grade math teachers. The goals themselves are measurable. We have to define and be talking about something that we can actually see, that we can actually touch, that we can actually measure the gains or changes in performance. The A is the achievable piece. Is it something that we can actually accomplish? Now, this is a bit of a balance when we're talking about achievable, because it's not only can we make those gains, but what gains do we need to make in order to accomplish our year-end goals or reach our year-end destinations. The R is relevancy. If we're going to take the time to collaborate around something, if we're going to monitor the effect of our practice, it darn well better be something that's important to the success of our students, to the success of our faculty, to our principals. I'm an English major. Ironically, for a data nerd, I actually started out as an English major, so I like to pick on the correct use of semicolon in a sentence. You know what? If we're taking a look at that, or author's purpose is far more important to our student success than knowing where to put that semicolon. And then the T is the time frame. By when do we hope to accomplish that? That does two things for us. It tells us the point at which we will measure this again, and gives us some specific time in which to take these actions, and by which we should see some gains.
One more question before we move on. This is, it seems like there's a lot to focus on. How do you get teachers to focus in a meeting on just one or two key strategies. And that really is important, but I want you to think about how you would coach teachers to give feedback to students. If a paper comes back and it's filled with red with 50 different things the student could do, or let's say at the end of an athletic maneuver, a coach describes for 20 minutes all the different things the student could have done better, that feedback has zero impact. Feedback that has impact is specific and immediate and is focused so on improving one move on the athletic field, one breath with the French horn, a transition from one sentence to another. And that kind of incremental feedback is far more effective than having somebody do a bunch of different things. So my counsel to you is, if we wanted to, once we've identified what some of our issues are, in the next couple of weeks between now and the next data team meeting, let's just try one different thing, maybe about the way that we assign homework, or maybe about the way that we give feedback during class. Change those things, and it's a perfect experiment. You've got the same kids, the same teacher, the same environment, but you start changing one or two variables, then you can observe what that has as an impact on your students. And we've got to proceed to make sure we keep within our time allotment.
All right, so this process, folks, again, those six simple steps, monitoring being in the middle, can be applied at all levels if we are classroom teachers, if we're specialists or special educators serving multiple grade levels, ESL teachers, principals, and central office administrators. What's, I think, absolutely beautiful about this in these times of tightening budgets is that it really is little financial investment required to implement this process. The most significant financial investment is really ensuring that we've got the collaborative time available. There's no new technology, no new data warehouses that need to be purchased. The most complicated thing that I see teachers and administrators using in terms of technology when they do this is Microsoft Excel as a simple means of helping them track the data. So again, a simple process, easy to implement. So folks, go ahead.
Somebody asked about incredibly high class sizes. That really does save a tremendous amount of time. The question was, when class sizes are so high, do you recommend sampling in terms of collecting and analyzing data? You can really, one of the things you must know at the teacher level is which students need intervention. So you really can't sample. At the teacher level, they need to be looking at every single student. Now at the administrator level or teacher coach level, then of course, you know, maybe you wouldn't be able to watch 100% of class times, but you should be able to make many observations that allow you to say, I'm going to spend 10 minutes at 10 different times. That's 100 minutes of observations. And each time I'm going to count the percentage of students who received feedback. And that's a very simple bar chart that will show, is the teacher able to give more feedback to students with deliberate effort? So sampling for teacher observation, yes. Sampling for students, no.
Yeah, I want to second that, folks. That's often a challenge, especially at the secondary level. And I have to tell you, I've witnessed high school teams with 160, 170 more students with whom they have contact in a day actually have student work samples for every single one of those students at the table. They put simple mechanisms in place to support them as they do this. In the case that I most recently observed, it was just 4 color-coded folders, and as they scored each of those assessments, they dropped them in one of those color-coded folders according to their level of performance. They made a quick note about the strengths and the needs of that paper, and oftentimes it was the same strength or the same need as the previous paper, so it was a matter of a ditto mark or a check mark. By the time they were finished scoring with 5 minutes of additional time, they not only had every single paper scored, they had it sorted, and they had a record of the analysis as they were scoring. You can't help but analyze the work as you're scoring it. So simple mechanisms to manage it, really beautiful to see it happening. Okay, so folks, again, no new technology, no new data warehouses, and we're going to show you some examples in the upcoming slides of this sort of analysis at every level. So, Doug, if you'll go ahead to the next one, please. We'll just skip right ahead. Oops. Sorry, folks. Got an extra slide left in there. If you'll pop one more for me. Okay. So here you go, folks. This is an example of a 6th grade team taking a look at post-test results on a common formative assessment. 4 different performance levels for their students. What percentage of their students was commended? What percent was proficient. So those two categories together, a little over 65% of their students were proficient or higher. This wasn't satisfactory for this team, and so they decided that they needed to take a little bit more time to stay on this topic. And they spent their time at this point analyzing, again, as Doug was talking about, some time saving. What are the remaining needs of the students that fell into the moderate need category, or in red here, the high need category, those students who needed specific interventions. Another interesting thing here is this team had actually put this post-test about 3 days prior to the actual end of the unit. So while it was labeled post-test, it was actually more of a final formative, and that gave them 3 more days in which to go back and respond to the data before giving their summative end-of-chapter assessment, end-of-unit assessment. Now, as we said earlier, it's not just the numbers that are important, and so as you take a look at the next slide here, you'll see the results of student analysis, teacher analysis of those student work samples. And so, whoops, please go back one for me, Doug. There you go. So in this case, folks, this was the group of students who fell into that moderate need category. As they were analyzing the work, what they identified was that this group had a prioritized need related to subtraction of fractions, so unlike denominators. As they looked at the work sample, they determined that the reasons for those errors were that these kids were really struggling with finding equivalent fractions. And so what are we going to do about it? And to that question of getting teachers to agree to a strategy, what you see represented here is what the team agreed in its collective wisdom would be the best instructional response. So the teachers, looking at the work of all of their kids, students represented in each of their classes, decided collectively that use of fraction sets to actually concretely model it, have kids record what they're finding, and then from there do some hypothesis testing and generate a rule or pattern from what they saw would be the best response. Now, this is not the only strategy that they used, but they all agreed this would be the best strategy to use in this case. Now, that's the classroom level, folks. If you'll take a look at the next slide here, we begin to take a look at what it might look like if a building is actually monitoring practice. And so in this case, you see what we describe as a building data team that is collecting information from data team, the instructional data team minutes. And so they've got a record of what the strategy is. An administrator or a specialist is getting in order to observe that strategy in action. And so in the first teacher's classroom, you simple chart here. 2 observations. Both times we saw the strategy in place. On a scale of 1 to 4, what was the quality of the strategy? The first time it was a 2, second time a 3. Did we provide that teacher feedback? And in both cases we did. And what were that teacher's results on the post-assessment? Well, 60% of these this teacher's students were proficient. Now, if you look at the difference in Teacher 2 and Teacher 3, Teacher 2 again used it both times, but at a higher level of quality, and that seems to have made a difference for our students. Now, of course, there are other things going on, but we could test this hypothesis. Is the level of use of this strategy related to gains in student achievement? And it certainly looks that way. Teacher 3, not using the strategy, so therefore no quality. Now, interestingly enough, we didn't provide feedback. So here's an opportunity for a building leadership team to reflect on its own practice. So what could we do to support this teacher? Is this an issue where the teacher would like to do this practice but doesn't have the capacity? So could we assign a math specialist or a helping teacher to get in and help model this practice in the classroom? Next level of analysis up from that is keeping an eye on what's going on in the school as a whole. And so as you take a look at the following slide here, folks, you'll see, again, what it might look like if a building data team, and let me define that term for a second, realized I haven't offered a definition. By building data team, we mean a team comprised of course, the administration, the building principal, assistant principal, dean, if such a person is present, instructional specialists, and teacher leaders. Typically, those teacher leaders are the instructional data team leaders. That building data team operates as a collaborative body to make decisions in support of what's going on in the classrooms. Now, folks, this is not a gotcha kind of monitoring, but this is a responsive kind of monitoring. How do we help teachers do what they said they're going to do in the interest of their kids.
Tony, we just had a question that is precisely on that issue. When you talk about formative assessment, talk about the degree to which those formative assessments are graded and how, if at all, they influence the final grade of the student. So it becomes, to what extent is it an evaluative experience? To what extent is it a learning experience?
It is predominantly a learning experience. Ideally, formative assessments are solely for the purposes of informing teachers on the effectiveness on their practice and identifying student needs. Formative assessments can also be used to set goals and learning targets for students. One of the frequent objections that we get in the field is, well, if it's not being graded, students won't take it seriously. And folks, I've seen that in my own classroom, but what was absolutely ironic to me was that same student who in my room would go, is this graded? No, I'm not going to pay attention to it, would go home and play Xbox or Wii for 4 hours while not receiving a grade. You know, they got data, they got information back, they set a new target for learning. Boy, this time when I went to the right, that was the end of that turn. Next time I know I need to go to the left. I want to improve my performance. I'm not saying that our formative assessments are going to be the next example of Xbox, but certainly when we pay attention to having students identify their own specific learning goals and identify actions that they can take to improve their performance and then track that progress over time, that's actually more effective than grading that assessment.
Students crave feedback, and so do adults. There's a ton of evidence on there, and I know sometimes people have belief systems that say they won't do it if it doesn't count. Observe students carefully, and you'll find all kinds of behaviors that get feedback that don't get a grade that still allow them to use that feedback to improve performance. That's what we've got to do. And if you've got to put something in your computer as evidence of feedback, all I'm asking is put it in metaphorical pencil, not pen. So if somebody uses your feedback to get better, then it's the improvement and the summative performance that's most important. You're not punishing them today in May for mistakes they made back in February.
And finally, folks, this process can be applied at a district level. So just as we're describing a building level data team, there really ought to be at least one, depending on the size of the district, often many district level data teams. In this case, what you see are the results of an department in a medium-sized school district that was paying attention to one of the major district initiatives, and that was the success of instructional data teams. And so you see the results of their observations in the first semester, total of 126 direct observations of instructional data teams in action. You see the percentage of teams that were exemplary at that step indicated in purple, proficient in green, progressing or not yet there in red, and just flat didn't see them in blue. And so this was early on in this district's implementation. So you can see they were getting pretty good at step one, but a lot of red in step two of the process. And so they wanted to put some structures in place in order to support their teacher teams in this critical step. Step two, as you recall, is that analysis piece. Now, where did this data come from? As Doug has described earlier, we've got to specifically observe practices and identify criteria for success. So in the next couple of slides, you'll see an excerpt of a rubric for the data team process. And on your screen here, you see a couple of the steps that are necessary in step two to be proficient. All of the analysis has got to come from a direct review of student work. So it's not just the numbers that we want to take a look at. We always want to go back to the standard. What's the target of our instruction? We want these sessions, these collaborative sessions, to be focused on teaching and learning, and so we've got to keep the focus on what we can do. Absolutely critical descriptor D here, not only what's wrong, that's the symptom, but the diagnosis is the why. Got to talk about the needs of each group if we're going to differentiate. Caroline Tomlinson says the differentiation begins with data. We've got the information, we have to identify the needs of each of our groups. And finally, before we leave step two, last piece is that we've got to prioritize our needs such that we know what we're going to target for that specific group of kids. Absolutely critical, folks. And this district, you saw their data. What they decided that they needed to work on was the work sample piece. Looking back on their observations, they realized that most of their data teams that were struggling were not bringing great assessments to the table, not bringing good student work samples to the table. And so they needed to provide some support in designing better formative assessments, better demands for student performance that they could bring in to analyze. Now, does this pay off? We, at a district level, have helped districts take a look at the impact of their professional practice on student achievement. Is there a relationship? And so as you take a look at the next slide here, you'll see the relationship that we found over several studies on the level of implementation of professional learning communities or teacher teams looking at data and math performance. Doug, would you like to speak to this one for just a little bit?
This is just one of literally hundreds of these type of slides that we have gathered in a process called the implementation review, and we study the extent to which people actually implement the details of something like professional learning communities. A lot of people claim they do PLCs, very few implement it at the highest level, and as you can see, two interesting things. Deep implementation does really help achievement, but medium implementation is not much better than low implementation, and that's very significant because most districts are trying to do too many initiatives all at the same time, getting very few of them at the highest level of implementation.
All right, so as we close out the formal portion of the presentation, really 4 challenges we'd like you to keep in mind, folks, as you're attempting to do this work. First, financial constraint. As Doug mentioned early on in our time together this morning, collaborative time is absolutely necessary. And that's a financial consideration. We have to provide time within the contract day for teachers to meet and administrators to meet. That means we have to take a look at how we're using the time we already have. We're not going to get more, so we need to use time more effectively. 47 out of 50 states are transitioning to Common Core standards. Even several of the states that are not are refining their standards. And so we have to pay attention to helping our teachers and leaders know the instructional implications of this higher level of rigor that will be represented. Political realities are a challenge. Many new states are looking at new teacher and new administrator evaluations. Almost every one of those has some component related to gains in student achievement, successful collaboration, and finally, a lack of focus. Where there are too many demands on the time of folks in our schools and in our central office. We absolutely have to focus on what we feel to be the most influential, the highest impact actions that we can take, measure and monitor the impact of those actions. If they're working, stay with them. If they're not, make immediate changes.
So I'd like to invite you to use the question function. Unfortunately, as we said, with almost 500 people on the line, we can't hear you, but we'd be happy to answer questions. And we've also got our emails up there. You're most welcome to send emails directly to us. Several people have asked when they can have these slides. Our colleague Adam Stevens is getting those put up on leadandlearn.com. All you need to do is just go to leadandlearn.com, click on the Multimedia Resource Center, and you'll find not only today's presentation, but other webinars and other articles, presentations, evidence that we've provided that we make available for free to schools all over the world. Other people asked if Tony is willing to come to school systems. Tony, about how many thousand miles did you travel last year?
Pushing 300,000, I believe.
So that's a short way of saying yes. He is the vast majority of our work, and we really believe in this. Doesn't happen in ivory tower, doesn't happen in hotel ballrooms. It happens in schools. Even when we do professional development, we also follow up with coaching on site with students present, with faculty present. So the whole idea is a commitment to deep implementation, not just one more superficial round of seminars. As I believe that I mentioned, John Hattie will be here this summer, and I certainly want to encourage him to encourage you to get to know him. He is the leading researcher. Hattie's Visible Learning for Teachers, the book that we mentioned earlier, is the largest educational database ever assembled. More than 50,000 studies, more than 250 million students. And you get away from the researcher A versus researcher B and move toward a synthesis of the evidence. And best yet, as I said, Visible Learning will help you and your colleagues assess the impact of your own teaching and leadership on student achievement. That's something that that we all need. Let's take a few more questions before we run out of time. What are some steps teachers, leaders, and coaches can begin to take to create a culture in which data is valued? And several people earlier asked about getting buy-in. I'll tell you, I would be happy to offer you two sources on that. Number one, there's a brand new book by Dr. Kathy Lassiter, that's Lassiter. I'll write it so everybody can see it, called the Secrets and Simple Truths of High-Performing School Cultures. And Dr. Lassiter's new book is splendid and precisely on this point. She also is going to address that issue of building culture at our Summer Leadership Institute. If you subscribe to the American School Board issue, my article, which just came out, is focusing on the same thing with a different twist, and that is you don't always get buy-in before you do this. In fact, you should expect to run into a certain degree of skepticism, and that's why I think sometimes when people make buy-in the threshold for any sort of effective data implementation, they're ensuring that they're not going to have any implementation, because there will always be somebody who doesn't buy in. So I'm suggesting a different approach. That's the May 2012 issue of American School Board Journal. And if you don't have that, we always are happy to give a copy of those articles away. Just ask for it. Let's see if we have any more. I'm looking for the best summary of Hattie's work on feedback. The best original source will be John Hattie's personal work in the book Visible Learning for Teachers. But if you want a shorter summary, he wrote a chapter in the book Activate. I have a chapter in that book as well, as do several other authors. And if you want just a shorter synthesis, getting the book Activate, published at Lead and Learn Press, that you'll find on the website, would be a shorter synthesis of his idea. How much time do you suggest for the data team meetings? Tony, why don't you handle that one?
Typically what we see is that as teams become practiced at the process, they need about 45 minutes to do this well. That means there are several things that have to happen outside of the meeting. Teachers have to have scored their work. They, as I described, that sorting process ahead of time, need to come in ready to begin talking about what they've identified in needs. Those things being done, we've seen this done really, really well in 45 minutes.
And which is interesting, because another question is, what sort of analysis is done of the data to confirm that the data is statistically relevant? In other words, do you use a program like SPSS, SAS, or other statistical program? I want to make sure that I'm distinguishing two things here. At the classroom level, you do not need SAS or SPSS. All you're talking about is bar charts showing proficient before, proficient after, and as Tony suggested, the before and after ought to be related to before and after a particular instructional intervention. It doesn't prove causation, we all know that, but it does show an association, and it also can disprove somebody saying, well, if you do this, then achievement will go down. You can disprove that hypothesis very clearly. Now, if by our data you mean the data that we do, of course, we use a variety of fairly sophisticated programs, everything from factor analysis to multivariate analysis of variance, depending. We try to use the right tool for the right job. It is interesting to me over the time that things that you used to only find in SAS or SPSS 10, 20 years ago, now you can find in Microsoft Excel. So it's a pretty rare statistical challenge that requires the elephant guns of SPSS and SAS, but we use the appropriate, for example, tests of reliability coefficients are things that we would do. But I wouldn't expect any classroom teacher or school data team to be doing ANOVA's analysis of variance or factor analyses. It is useful for us because that's what allows me to look at, for example, millions of cells of data and say which ones have the greatest impact on each other, and that's how we develop a constellation of practice, if you will. For if the more statistically inclined of you might want to read the book published by Columbia University Teachers College Press that I wrote called Finding Your Leadership Focus. Did you say that there are videos that demonstrate effective PLCs? There are, and I'll tell you the way that what we did, these are absolutely unscripted. We just went into schools, including where Tony was, and just let the camera roll. And we interviewed teachers. We watched them while they actually were engaged, and then we interviewed them separately to get an idea of what were they thinking about when they went through these things. We captured laughter. We captured challenges. And we did this at every level. We have elementary, middle, and high school. And we also interviewed teachers, administrators, and even board members about how they used the professional learning framework to actually implement data teams. I fear that PLCs alone is a pretty broad, sometimes ambiguously defined term. We've got it down to a very specific science so that you're not just done if you've kind of professionally held hands and collaborated. You're done only when you've gone through the cycle of using specific data and made a decision based on that. Please write the last letter book notation. I will do that right now. Okay. So I believe, Tony, anything in closing that you want to say?
Folks, as Doug described, the need to get in on the ground and do the work. The successful schools that we've seen are ones where the leadership of the school and the district are focused on helping teachers do a better job of making use of data, and that means that they're paying attention to that practice and providing feedback. Not going to be perfect, but every time we do this, we get a little bit better at it.
Well, I want to thank Tony, and I want to thank our very large audience for hanging in there with us. We always respect your time and end when we say we're going to. If you didn't get your particular question answered, I want to invite you to email Tony or myself. We really believe in being very, very responsive to you, and so that's why the telephone number is up there, and you can email us at any time. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, folks.